In this video, I'm going to talk about a few additional long-run ideas. So just to get our head in the right place, remember when we're talking about a business, in the short run, there's going to be some inputs that they can't change. They can't increase or decrease the amount of. And the easiest ones to think about here are usually capital, things like buildings and machines. They take longer to change than most other things. And another one we might think about that's a long-run resource, it's harder to reallocate or change the amount of, would be entrepreneurship. If you have one entrepreneur or a couple of entrepreneurs who are organizing and running a business, it's going to take a while for them to be able to reallocate their time to start or organize and manage another industry. So in the short run, we usually think about a business can change the amount of variable costs, and the things that are easiest to change in the shorter run are going to be things like labor and materials. Today, as a business produces more, they're going to use more labor, more materials, and more other things, perhaps like electricity or petroleum products, things like that. But only in the long run could they either increase the amount of buildings and machines, decrease the amount of buildings and machines, or get rid of all the buildings and machines and decrease the amount to zero. So the first long-run idea I want to talk about today is what happens if a firm wants to grow larger. In particular, we want to focus on what are the possibilities for what could happen to the cost per unit, or the average total cost. So let's just look at an example of some numbers I made up. Let's look at 3 different possible total cost tables, and instead of calculating everything here, I'm just going to focus on average total cost, or the cost per unit, because that's the most important thing for a firm whenever they're going to look at profitability and whether they're going to be able to compete given the market price. Are they going to be able to break even, or are they going to be forced to lose money? So let's suppose that you had a small firm, and that a small firm, just for this example, means that they have 2 factories. And each factory costs, say, $25 a piece per day. And with 2 factories, if you produce 0, those 2 factories are going to cost $50. Let's just assume those are the only fixed costs that we had. But as you produce more units, your total costs go up. And let's look at what happens to average total cost. As usually happens, average total cost starts high, then decreases down to a minimum. And here we see that minimum here is $52 per unit. So that's the lowest average total cost this firm could produce, and that's when they're producing 5 units. Now suppose this firm decided they wanted to grow, to get more factories. Well, let's suppose that when the firm does this, they discover that their total cost looks like this. Now, since they're a bigger factory, we're looking at larger quantities of output here. But we see that this firm that now has the 6 manufacturing plants, or 6 factories, when they're producing, they are able to produce at a cheaper cost if they're at the right level of output. Their minimum average total cost is $46 per unit. So if you were a firm and you were in an industry where, say, the equilibrium price was $52, and you figured out that if you got bigger, and by getting bigger you could produce more efficiently at a lower average total cost, then you'd want to do that. Now, what we call this, whenever a firm can get larger, and by going from being small to medium, their average total cost, at least for some units, decreases, we call that increasing returns to scale. There are actually 2 terms for it. So what we're witnessing here is increasing returns to scale, or another term for this we call economies of scale. And that just means that as a business expands and gets bigger, they make everything bigger. The word scale implies we're scaling up the entire operation. So more land, more labor, more capital, and more entrepreneurship would also be something we would normally assume would happen here as well. As you get bigger, you get more efficient. Your cost per unit goes down. That's economies of scale, or increasing returns to scale. So let's suppose that this firm decided they wanted to try this again. Hey, we got bigger, and by getting bigger, we got more efficient. We were able to produce at a lower average total cost. Suppose they decide to try this again. They go from being a medium firm with, say, 6 plants to a large firm. They decide to double in size. Well, what happens now? Well, they're able to produce a lot more units, right? The quantities here are higher and the total costs are higher because they're producing more units. But if this is a good decision, we want to see if they're more efficient. Are their costs per unit increasing or decreasing? And that's where the average total cost is important. So when we look at these average total costs and we look at the cheapest way that they could produce units here, it looks like the cheapest production level is at 30 units, and the cheapest production cost is $55.33 each. $55.33 per unit. So it looks like in this example that might be a mistake. Because if there are medium-sized firms out there competing with you and they're able to produce at $46 a unit and you're this huge firm, and because you're huge, your costs per unit are higher, you're going to go out of business. You are going to be unable to compete with these medium-sized firms. So when a firm experiences this, when they get larger, when they expand everything, they scale up the operation, in other words, and their cost per unit goes up. Instead of calling this increasing returns to scale, you guessed it, we call this decreasing returns to scale. Another term that means the exact same thing as decreasing returns to scale, instead of economies of scale, sometimes people will describe what's going on here as diseconomies of scale. So in one case, we see a firm getting bigger, their average total cost goes down, increasing returns to scale or economies of scale. In the second scenario here, we see as they get bigger, their average total costs increase, so they get decreasing returns to scale or diseconomies of scale. Now there actually is a third possibility, and that would be if you got bigger, if your average total cost stays the same, we call that constant returns to scale. So constant returns to scale would be if you get bigger and then you discover that your average total cost, your cost per unit, just stays the same. So there's no benefit to scaling up your business and getting bigger, and there's no bad thing happening either. What it looks like on a cost graph, here I have graphed the average total cost curves here for the small firm over here, and the medium and the large firm in red. And basically what we're looking for is what's the minimum average total cost there. So if we take a horizontal line and we look at where's the bottom of this curve for the small, we can just see on the graph that it looks like it's somewhere around $50. Of course, on the table up here, we see it's 52, right? But then for the medium firm, we see clearly that their minimum cost here is lower than the one over here for the small firm. So that's how we can tell graphically that there must be increasing returns to scale, because the minimum of the orange average total cost curve is lower than that for the blue. But then, similarly, we can see that the minimum average total cost for the large firm with the lots of factories is definitely higher than for the medium. And so when we go from medium to large, we see diseconomies of scale or decreasing returns to scale. And this is a concept that is a valid thing to think about, whether or not we're talking about perfectly competitive industries, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, or monopolies. It's just the idea. If you make a business larger, if you scale the whole thing up, what happens? Does your average total cost go down, or does your average total cost go up? Just depends on the industry. In some industries, it's more efficient to be small and quick and nimble. And in other industries, say if you want to be a company that produces airplanes, you have to be large. The only way to do it is to be a huge company. And that's why there are only two real major manufacturers of large airplanes, large airliners. However, there are a lot of other ones that make much smaller planes. Here I'm talking about Boeing and Airbus, the primary two large aircraft manufacturers out there. So that's one concept. Returns to scale. What happens as you scale up your business? Our next topic for the day is what happens in the long run as more firms enter into an industry. So here we're thinking about an idea where there's an industry that might be very small. So let's suppose, let me draw, say, an initial demand curve here. Suppose this is the initial demand for an industry, not a lot of quantity being demanded for this good, and here's the initial supply curve, which would be based on the marginal cost curve and how many businesses are in this industry. So let's suppose that this is what was going on right now. It looks like in the graph, the way I've drawn it, that the equilibrium price might be about $55. All right, well, let's look and see what's going on. Let's suppose we only have a few firms in this industry right now. We have fewer than 100 firms, and so each of these firms has a cost table that looks something like this. And in order for these firms to be able to break even or make a profit, the price has to be $52 or greater, right? At a price of 52, they're breaking even. Anything higher, they're making a profit. So the way I've drawn these initial supply and demand graph, these firms are making a profit because that equilibrium price looks like it's about $55. So what we would expect to happen in the long run is for more firms to enter and to bring that equilibrium price down to around 52. Right? So here's our new supply curve 2. So as more firms enter, pushes the prices down until they're breaking even. There's no incentive for more firms to enter anymore. So this would be what we would expect to happen in the long run. However, suppose this is a product that's very popular now. A lot more people want it. Suppose this demand curve increases a lot and the demand curve shifts. Here's our second demand curve. Now we see the equilibrium price is way up here at $90. So these firms are going to be making huge profits. Okay, in the short run, they can make the huge profits, but we know what happens in the long run if this is a perfectly or purely competitive industry. There's freedom of entry and exit, easy to get into this industry, easy to get out. But if people are making huge profits, it's going to be an incentive for people to get into this industry. And so in the long run, we're going to observe more entry, and we're going to see people enter until we get that equilibrium price back down to the break-even price. Here's supply curve 3, right? So we're always going to be heading until we get to that break-even price over here of $52. So the only way that this can happen forever, that demand keeps increasing and then firms keep entering until we get that equilibrium price back down to the long-run price or the break-even price, is if as firms enter, the cost structure of every business that enters is identical and exactly the same as the firms that came before it. And that's what I have in mind here with this first example. I say the first 100 firms, this is what their cost tables look like. The next 100 firms, their cost tables look exactly identical. And the next 100 firms, well, their cost tables look exactly the same. So in this case, we're saying that as this industry grows and becomes larger and the product becomes more popular, there's nothing limiting more firms from entering in. There's nothing driving the costs of the things that these firms use up. So there's not something that's getting scarce as these firms use more and more and more of a certain kind of resource. Or if they're using land, land's not getting more and more scarce. So the cost structure of these firms stays identical, no matter how many firms enter, right? That's how we can have this long-run equilibrium price of $52 always. So this fat purple line that I just drew, what this kind of indicates that even though in the short run we can have demand increase and we can have profits, or we could have demand decrease and we could have losses, this fat purple line says that in the long run, no matter how much people want to buy, the industry can always supply it at a constant cost of $52. In other words, the quantity supplied can be anything. It can be 100 or 500 or 1,300 or 5,000 for that matter, and the quantity supplied can be any number for a constant price of $52. So that's why sometimes we'll call this kind of long-run trend in the price. As the quantity increases or decreases, we'll call that the long-run supply curve. And this long-run supply curve is perfectly horizontal, perfectly flat, because here we're assuming that firms can keep entering and entering and entering, and their average total costs don't go up and don't go down. They just always stay the same as the firms that came before them. So this is a long-run supply curve because a supply curve tells us what quantity will be supplied at each price. And here we see in the long run, not in the short run, but in the long run, firms will be able to supply any amount desired at this long-run price of $52. This is what we would call a constant cost industry. Constant cost industry. It means that as expansion happens in the amount being produced, there's nothing pushing the costs up, and there's also nothing driving the costs down. But of course, as you know by now, there are other possibilities. We could have an increasing cost industry. And an increasing cost industry is one where the first firms that enter in might have a cost table that looks like this, where the minimum average total cost is 52. But then at some point, as more and more firms try to get into this industry, there's some resource that they need. It might be the land that you need to put the factories on or the stores in. It might be the kind of workers you need to hire, or it might be some kind of material that you need in order to make your product. It starts getting rarer and rarer. And as things get rarer and rarer, the price tends to get driven up. So here, the next 100 firms, they find that their total costs and average total cost, or cost per unit, are higher. $62.40 is the minimum for these next firms coming in. And then these older firms that have been there, maybe their costs are still low. And then the next 100 firms after them, maybe their average total costs are even higher. So what does this imply? Well, it implies that if this industry is only producing a small amount of output, demand is low, here's our supply curve, that maybe that equilibrium price could be $52. And all the firms are breaking even. But if there are already 100 firms in the market, and then demand increases to demand 2, of course in the short run that's going to drive the market price up. And these firms will be happy. They'll be making big profits. But those big profits will cause other people to say, you know, I ought to get into that industry. But these next firms that are going to enter, their break-even price is higher, $62.40. So as these additional firms enter into this industry, they're only going to keep entering as long as the market price is $62.40 or higher. So here looks like that might be around $62.40. So as these additional firms enter, this is the next stage in our long-run equilibrium that we would see. Equilibrium price after the entry stops. Is not going to bring the price back down to 52. It'll bring it down to $62.40. But then, if demand increases wildly even again, for a short run, all these firms will be making profits. But in pure competition, you can't have profits over and above that minimum normal profit that entrepreneurs desire forever. And so it's going to encourage other people to enter. And as these firms enter, though, this next batch of 100 firms, they're only going to come in until the price gets down to $74.88. So let's call it about 75, just to kind of round it off and be approximate here. So here's where the next round would end. Supply curve 3. So if this keeps happening in this kind of pattern, think about what that long-run supply curve is going to look like. It's not a horizontal line. What this shows us is in the long run, as output expands further and further and further, the price keeps going up and up and up. So here we would have this long run supply curve that is upward sloping. And this is an example here of an increasing cost industry. And again, I most commonly think about increasing cost industries when there's something like land that is getting used up or getting scarcer and scarcer. So this might be if we're talking about a particular city. As in a particular part of a city, more and more people try to build restaurants and build other businesses, the price of the land for those businesses is going to get driven up and up and up, and it's going to make it more and more expensive, increasingly expensive, to build an additional business in that area to increase the supply of food or whatever else people want. And of course, there's a third possibility. There's a decreasing cost industry. So with a decreasing cost industry, the first few firms might have a minimum average total cost of 52. The next 100 firms might find that it's easier, cheaper to produce than the initial firms that came in. And then the firms after that might find it even cheaper. Now, what might be an excuse or a real-world situation where we might see this decrease in costs as more and more and more firms pile into an industry? Typically, it's something where the people in this industry are manufacturing something, and these manufacturers depend on specialists, whether it's specialist tool makers or specialist repair people, or some kind of knowledge that as there are more and more and more businesses, these support industries, the support industries that make some of the machinery and equipment get better and better at making the things you need in order to create one of these companies in this pure competition framework. So the first few firms that might want to build something like self-driving cars, they have a lot of costs that they have to bear because they're the first ones. And there's not a lot of support out there in the sensors that the cars need and the software that the cars need in order to work properly. But as this industry grows and grows, the next 100 firms to pile in to make some of these self-driving cars and that related kind of technology, they're going to find that their average total cost is cheaper than the people that came before them. And then the next 100 firms, even cheaper. And so, as you would expect, we're going to see the opposite of the case we had before. So initially, when there are only a few firms, we might see that the average total cost, the minimum, and therefore the break-even price is $52. But then, as the demand for this technology increases, and the next few firms start to pile in to take advantage of those profits, they find that it's easier because the technology is more developed and the support infrastructure of the other firms they rely on to get started are already there and well developed and have really good technology. Those firms are going to keep entering until they drive the market price down to $41.60, somewhere around there. All right? And then, again, this could happen one more time. And then, because the break-even price of the next 100 firms, they find it even easier and cheaper than the people that came before them, they're going to continue to pile into this industry until they drive the price down to $33.28. And so, when we look at that long-run trend of the price, we see that as the quantity people want of this good increases, that this market can supply it for ever cheaper and ever cheaper prices. And so this long-run supply curve is decreasing, and this is what we call a decreasing cost industry. So I'm going to end this video here. This is just a couple of topics we hadn't talked about yet. If you have any other topics that you want me to address or any other particular questions, please feel free to let me know, and I'll do my best to get back to you and address those. But otherwise, this is Dr. Berkey signing out. I'm glad you joined me for this video, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye now.